One of the most important types of elements in Super Mario Maker 2 are containers. Now these aren't like your enemies or gizmos where they are clearly separated into their own categories, rather these are items that all share one special property, that being the ability to contain items inside of them. This is useful in all sorts of scenarios, keeping items in place until the player interacts with them, surprising the player with an item, building machinery, and so on. The way I'll be defining containers for the purposes of this video are items that are able to hold another type of item that isn't a key. I'm putting the key limitation on here because then every enemy in the game would be considered a container, and I really don't feel like breaking someone's heart today for putting the spiny in F tier. Under this definition, there were 15 items I was able to find that act as containers, which I took mostly from the Mario Maker 2 wiki, but just added on the note blocks and music note blocks, which weren't there despite clearly fitting the definition. As I hinted at before, we'll be throwing all these items into a tier list, but one thing I do want to say is that this is purely focused on how good these items are as containers. Some of these items have other uses as well, but we're only going to be looking at the container aspect of these items. Oh, and one last thing before we start, containers are generally really helpful items, so even if I put something in F tier, I may not even think it's necessarily that bad, it's just that something had to go there. But with all that finally said, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and let's jump right into our first container. We're just gonna go in the order these items appear in the selection wheel, so that means our first item is the pipe. We'll mostly focus on the unique traits of each container, but since this is our first, we're gonna go ahead and cover some of the basic container stuff. This is pretty much able to contain any enemy or item in the game. Exceptions like Pink Coins, the Angry Sun, Cool Bowser, the Koopalings, and so on do exist, but for the most part, this is able to hold pretty much anything the other containers can. The only major exceptions to this are vines and keys. While this does certainly hinder the item a bit, these limitations are not nearly as bad as they could be. One other minor limitation is that the pipe at its smallest is 2x2 tiles, which means it sometimes can be harder to work with than a 1x1 tile container, but for the most part, this is a non-issue. Now let's look at what makes the pipe unique in a positive way. This will spit out its items from the lip of the pipe and only the lip, and since you can turn the pipe, this allows you to control where the items appear from. These items also aren't able to be spat out unless there's space for them to, which opens up opportunities to make levels around trying to open up a pipe to get an item. The pipes also won't spit things out if Mario is touching the end of it, that way enemies won't kill him if he's just standing on it. Now all of that was great, but the main reason pipes are so nice is that they can dispense their items infinitely. When you hit a question mark block and it spits out its item, that's it, there's no getting another one. Pipes on the other hand are able to respawn their items infinitely, with a few exceptions. This lets players try a challenge multiple times that uses an item, respawn enemies to keep the player on their toes, and so on. This is essential in many complex level types, and there's pretty much only one other item that can also respawn its items infinitely. Add on the fact that you can even adjust how quickly the pipe dispenses its items, and we've got ourselves a pretty easy S tier. Sure, it does have a few limitations, but it's just far too helpful to leave it out at the top. Bricks and question mark blocks we'll cover together because they are the same when it comes to being a container. These are just about as basic and simple as a container can get. When they're jumped into, they'll spit out whatever item is inside. They can hold everything a pipe can, but also will be able to have vines and keys, which pipes cannot. Of course, these can only have their items dispensed once, like I said. However, that's not necessarily a downside. Sometimes you want the player to only get one item at a time. Take any traditional level, for example. You'll almost always want to give the player only one power-up to avoid them just running back and forth to refill whenever they get hit. One other nice thing about these blocks is that they can be activated by other objects like shells, making them helpful in more scenarios to spawn items away from the player. One last really nice thing these blocks have over others is that they're destructible by bombs and other large items. Overall, these are essential parts in nearly every level in the game. It would be pretty hard to find a good level missing these two items, so for that, these are also easy S tiers. I promise the next one won't be, but these being the faces of container blocks really made there be no other choice of placement for them. The hidden block is very similar to the last two, but has one major difference. Can you guess what it is? That's right, it's actually invisible. Oh wait, I never placed it down. The hidden block is invisible until the player hits it. Now I do have to stress the player part, as while the last two items could be activated by a variety of things, hidden blocks will only show themselves if a player jumps into them from below. Additionally, objects will also be able to occupy the same space as the hidden block until it's activated, which can make it more helpful in contraptions. However, keep in mind that this is a container tier list, and when it comes to that, this is a bit tough to judge. Since these blocks are invisible, more often than not, these are used to hide power-ups from the player player so that the level creator can use them to cheat their own level. Additionally, these can be used to create seemingly impossible levels where you have to try and find a hidden block in order to, say, complete a clear condition. This can be even worse if that block is placed on a track, which can permanently lock the player out of being able to beat a stage. Now, I know that we should generally judge items based on their peak, as obviously a bad level creator can ruin any item, but this is definitely one of the items that gets abused the most. Plus, it's also just really hard to use well. I think the best usage for these are giving the players 1-ups, since that clearly doesn't help the level creator at all. It gets hard once you have to put literally anything else in them, because it'll just give the impression that the block was placed there in order to help the creator. And on top of all that, placing these in the wrong spot can lead to some very unfair deaths. With all that said though, it does still have some uses like I said, it's just much harder to implement well. I'm going to be placing this in B tier. Its ability to still hold a ton of items does keep this up higher than some of the later containers. Another 2-in-1 here with the note block and music note block. Okay, I know they're basically the same thing, I just think ranking 15 items looks a lot better than ranking 14, alright? These are able to hold all of the same items as the last few, though how this block functions is a bit different. For starters, it's indestructible. No matter how many thwomps slam into it, this thing's gonna be alright. The main difference here though is how the items inside of the block are dispensed. Note blocks are mostly used as sort of floating springs, but that's not the purpose we're here to focus on. Due to that, however, when the block is activated, the item inside of it will be launched out, rather than just placed out like the other blocks. This has its niche uses. Generally I prefer how the other blocks work, but there certainly are uses for this. The main reason you'd want to use a note block though is the fact that it can be activated from the top. By simply landing on the block, it will dispense its item out from below. This is very helpful, especially for game styles without ground pounds. What makes this especially good though is that anything can land on top of the block and activate it. Power-ups, enemies, twister- oh, not that one. This makes it incredibly useful for interacting with several objects in the game. For that reason, I find the note and music block to be much more helpful for machinery, rather than just being placed throughout the level like the ones in S tier. I think that makes it more than fair to place these two items in A tier. They aren't nearly as common as the ones above, but their use is something only they can do, which makes them incredibly valuable. Now that we're done with the terrain, and I guess item section since there are no containers there, we get to look at the enemies. Now I know that I said most enemies don't count since they can only hold keys, but there are 4 enemies that are actually able to hold on to more than that. Those being Lackatoo, Lackatoos Cloud, the Clown Car, and the Fire Clown Car. Starting off with Lackatoo, he's able to hold anything that the pipe could, basically meaning he won't be able to throw vines or keys. Lackatoo will follow the player throughout the level and occasionally toss down the item it's holding, and much like the pipe, it'll do so infinitely. There are a few more items it has a limit on, namely power-ups, but for the most part it's infinite. Now obviously this does have the upside of being a container that will always be on screen. However, there are a number of problems with Lackatoo that's gonna keep him low on the tier list. For starters, when and where he throws the items are pretty much down to randomness. Now that's not entirely a bad thing. When used as an obstacle to throw down enemies, this can actually be quite good, but aside from that, there's not much use for this guy. Additionally, the player can kill Lackatoo by simply jumping on him. That means that the level has to be very restrictively designed to prevent them from doing this. The severe lack of control is what really hurts Lackatoo's use and makes him much more niche than some of the other containers. I'm going to be placing him in D tier. Its use as an obstacle container is good enough to keep it from F, but it's not much better than that. The other 3 enemy containers all work very similarly. Normally these act as vehicles for Mario to fly around a level with. However, most objects can be placed in them as well to allow them to fly. This even includes stuff that wasn't able to be placed in the other containers, like thwomps and bosses. Now yeah, these aren't really containers in the same way as the others so far, but they were on the wiki so I thought I might as well cover them just in case. Like Lackatoo, these are mostly just used to create unique obstacles. Having a fire piranha plant shoot down at you from above, having a boss fight against Bowser in his clown car, and so on. I will say though that I do like these as obstacles better as you have a bit more control over them since you don't have to worry about them randomly throwing items. Plus for the clown cars, you can actually place items inside of them by either throwing them in or having them fall into it. This does have some niche purposes. It's not the most helpful gimmick, but it can be nice to have. So I think I'll place all 3 of these into C tier. Definitely very niche items, but they can be quite helpful for making certain obstacles. Onto our last tab of items, we have our first 2 gizmos, the Bill Blaster and Bullseye Bill Blaster. Okay, I know they're basically the same thing, I just think ranking 15 items looks a lot better than ranking 13, alright? These have the same item set as the Lackatoo, however don't let that fool you as these are significantly better. These will always shoot out their items at whatever side the player is on. This can be helpful as you can not only control when the blaster can or cannot shoot out an item, but also have it shift sides depending on where the player moves. Additionally, when they fire out items like shells, they will already be moving rather than just staying in place, which makes these some of the most helpful items when making contraptions. Not only that, but Bill Blasters are able to be affected by gravity, so that means they are some of the few containers we can actually move. Yeah, we could technically move the last few, but none provide for as much control as the two Bill Blasters. Add on the fact that the Bullseye Bill Blaster can be used to fire out items quicker, and we have ourselves another fantastic set of containers. And on top of all of that, these can be even stacked on enemies, meaning they're great for making some even more unique obstacles. I really can't see an argument for anything other than S tier for these guys. It does everything the pipe can do, and I'd say it does it even better. I've used these things in nearly all of my levels. They're that good. The crate is the one and only 3D World exclusive container, and it only made the list by a technicality. I said that containers consist of any item that can hold something that isn't just a key, and well, the crate can hold not only keys, but coins as well. That's it though. Yeah, this is really lame. I would have loved to be able to put stuff like the power-ups or maybe even surprise enemies in here, but no, they're just used for coins and keys. That seems super dumb. It's just another thing that makes the 3D World game style seem all the lamer. I mean, I can't even think of a really good use for this. Maybe a level where you have to carry a crate with a key in it to the end? I don't know. This is easily an F tier. Had it been able to hold more items, it'd be a lot better. Speaking of a container with a very limited selection of items, we have the checkpoint. Now I cannot stress enough that this tier list is purely looking at these items as containers. Obviously the checkpoint is one of the best items in the game, there's no questioning that, but when looking at it as a container, well, it's pretty weak. It can have more items in the crate though, so that's something. You're able to put any power up inside of the checkpoint, and once the player grabs it, they'll obtain the item. Honestly, this is a pretty forgettable feature. I rarely see people use it outside of just giving people a mushroom. I will say though, having the option to not give people any power up is nice, especially since Mario Maker 1 forced anyone to get a mushroom when they hit it. So yeah, this is definitely a good feature, it's just not one I see much. Something I think would be neat is if the player died in the level, they spawned at the checkpoint with whatever power up was in it. Or at least that could have been an option. I wouldn't want that to be the default way they work, I just think it would be kinda cool. So for having a significantly more limited selection of items than the other containers, but for not being stupidly shallow like the crate, the checkpoint gets to be D tier. Again, this is as a container, this is a great item otherwise. And our final item is one that I'm really not sure if I'd count it, but the wiki had it, so I might as well. Tracks are able to have the most amount of items placed on them out of every container block in the game. While it still can't have vines or keys, it can have several different blocks and platforms alongside the other items. This includes other containers, so in terms of number of items, this is easily on top. The main thing that makes tracks so good though is the amount of customization they allow for. They basically let you entirely control the route of anything placed on it, making this one of the most important tools in the entire game. Want to have the player ride a platform through an obstacle course? Use a track. Want to have an item stay in place? Use a track. There are so many different scenarios where this guy can come in handy. Another great thing about tracks is that any item placed on top of them will be able to go through blocks, making them even more useful for transporting or moving items. Now yeah, this isn't really the same sort of container like everything else I've talked about, but even then, it's so good at its job of holding things that it easily makes the S tier. Nothing else is really able to replicate its functionalities, so it's another essential just like everything else in this tier. But anyways, that's it for this video. Are you all mad at me that I didn't include the rotating blocks from Super Mario World as a separate item from the bricks? Let me know in the comments. Sorry that this video is pretty short. Again, I'm trying my best to stick with a weekly schedule despite how busy I've been. Also, I know this was a pretty top-heavy list, but hey, container items are usually really good. If you all know of any other item types you'd like to see a tier list for, let me know in the comments. This one was actually pretty fun to come up with. But I think that's enough from me. Dry bones for Smash, and I'll see you guys next time.